Seferiana Day, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me today.
Well, we have been talking about this issue of people that are either in political office or maybe considering to run for political office, but especially those that are in office who suddenly find themselves targets. And I mean, targets in the way of people coming to their homes, protesting there, threatening them. And of course, we know that this was a thing that really got going during COVID, particularly with public health folks. But what are you seeing with people that are prospective candidates or the candidates that you work with out there that are going to run for political office?
Yeah, well, I work mostly with younger first-time candidates, mostly people of color. I'm in my mid-30s, so similarly aged people who are just really excited to serve and want to be there for their communities. And a lot of folks are maybe starting families. They've got maybe young kids. And so that's something that I often will talk about is your family going to support you, and is this something that you want that you want to put your family through, honestly. And especially at the city level, I think since probably districts began back in 2015 or so, I think there's been a shift in the way, kind of in the tenor and the way that people treat our elected officials at the city level, especially. So I've talked to folks who are really considering running for the first time, and they might say, well, my wife just had a baby and I'm actually not so sure I'm going to do that, or I'm going to wait a few years until the time is right. And I think, we've seen people leave office in the middle of a term because they have a young family. And I think that that's a common thing, is that you're not just running for yourself, but your whole family in some ways is running. And so it's really about how it impacts everyone around you.
So
So
what's
the,
behind these people
yeah,
that are doing this stuff, that come to someone's home and flip them off or threaten them?
or put graffiti or throw rocks through their windows.
Right.
Yeah, I would say part of me wants to say, we are in crisis. I've lived in Seattle for 17 years, and through that time, we've had a 10-year plan to end homelessness. It hasn't happened. We've had growth, we've had displacement of communities of color. There's a lot of frustration. And I think that's part of what is making people maybe so upset that they go to someone's house. But I think on the flip side, we've also got sort of this almost dehumanization of our elected leaders, right? We forget that they're people too. And I think that that's part of it. I think that you've got people that are really frustrated, and they're looking at this elected that to them isn't really even a person, and they can just march on their home and not really think about the consequences.
Well, it's interesting because one of the common denominators when we talk to people is most of the people that show up at people's houses are white. In fact, when Juarez was attacked, the Black community called her and said, "Hey, we're sorry this happened." So, is this part of the new white privilege that they can actually just go there because there's never been any consequence, right? Think about a group of brown people marching on a white official's house. The bullets would start flying almost immediately. I mean, there would be violence, right? But because they're privileged young white adults that probably have never had consequences, they all had their participation trophies. But I got to believe there's something to that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I do think it's a huge privilege, especially in a city like Seattle that is predominantly white. That there's a lot of attention paid to language and to saying the right thing. There's not a lot of nuance, and I think, and I am a progressive, I'll say it, but there is, on the left, there is really not a lot of room for nuance or really bringing all stakeholders to the table to build policy. Like, to me, that's what it takes to build good policy. And I think we're kind of running up against this idea that if you don't say the right thing, you're out, or if you don't go as far as is needed the first time, then you're out. And I think that is a very white privileged space to be in.
But
Yeah, I
there
mean,
are also we're seeing young people of color who are in their 30s or younger that have been involved in some of the protests and things, who kind of act the same way, but in a different way, in the sense because they want something now, and they don't want any negotiation. They want the action now. They want the police to be defunded, whatever the topic might be or the issue is.
yeah.
So
I mean,
there is that.
the whole cancel culture thing
Right.
is sort of derailed democracy in a lot of ways, because democracy is about coming together with ideas, whether you like them or not, and talking it out. But the cancel culture is kind of undemocratic.
Yeah, and it kind of gets back to that idea that we've got a lot of issues that are kind of at crisis mode, and how do we really take swift action? And I think that we're not necessarily seeing that from on the part of our elected leaders, that we can solve these big problems that have been happening for decades, with something creative, with something innovative, because there is a lot of kind of picking around at the edges. I was reading that article that in the Seattle Times about the vote on the $10 cap for late fees, and that was kind of what Council President Morris was saying, was we're just nibbling at the edges here. We're not even really making a change. And so I think that it's kind of a challenge to our elected leaders to just really be bold. And I think we're not seeing a lot of bold action.
Do you think that's because of who decides that they could run? I mean, let's talk honestly. I mean, is it the quality of the candidates and their character that are running? Because people that really want to make a difference sometimes just won't put themselves through that. Or if they do, maybe there's other ways they can express their activism.
Yeah, and I think in Seattle, you kind of get this you get the stranger in the Seattle Times, and those are the biggest endorsements. My Michael Charles, my business partner in consulting, will always talk about those two kind of avenues. And it's true. We have, if you're a person that's kind of in the middle, or if you're a little less progressive or a little more toward the middle, you're probably not going to make it through a primary. That's just kind of where we are. And so I think that can make it really hard for someone who is sort of in the middle, maybe a little more reasonable. It can be harder for them to make it through. Yeah.
Is that because they're going to get beat up by the stranger?
I mean, yeah. I mean, they're going to get challenged, I think, from those two sides. And it's tricky because you really do want someone in office who's going to bring different folks to the table and look at the equity implications for something, and also look at, how do we cause the least harm for maybe the landlords, the small landlords or small businesses. You want, at least I really want, folks in office that are going to have those hard conversations. But I think getting through the campaign, which is how you even get elected, is where you kind of find that you have to really pick a side.
Yeah. Well, as a consultant, how much does likability play into this? If people like you, because ultimately, what I've learned is that's the majority of people vote on. I like the person. I think they're a good person. More so on the nuances of their policy. I mean, how much does that play into it?
I think likability is important. I think being able to see yourself in the person that you're electing, I think, is very important. I also think the other piece that we really stress is values, because values are really universal. So how are we connecting? How am I as a candidate connecting to the voter, to their values? Because we often have shared values. We often kind of want the same things. And so I think it's also about that. While we may not agree on everything politically, our values kind of universally tend to be really similar.
And how does the setup now with districts affect all of this? Because that, okay, if you represent an area of, say, the Beacon Hill or the central area and all of that. It's going to be a lot different than if you're somebody that lives in Ballard or on Magnolia. Talk about that. How is there a different sense of what that person needs to be and how they need to represent?
Yes, I would say there's some slight differences. I think Seattle as a whole tends to be very similar across districts, but there are these kind of small changes. When we're looking at District 2, if you're in the South End, it's going to be really important that you're reaching voters of color, that you're talking to people in language, that you're really cognizant of the history of displacement. I live in District 1, West Seattle. The bridge was a big topic when that was going on.
Right.
How are we going to partner with our county, with Sound Transit? So I think, with maybe Magnolia, there's the bridge, there's all these different kind of smaller issues that are really important, I think, for candidates to touch on.
Right.
But again, the values are kind of the same, where it's accountability, it's transparency, it's being there. I think a major difference that I've seen since I worked at the city council from 2014 to 2018, kind of as we were transitioning to districts, and I worked for a citywide council member. And I remember it just kind of shifting, where we're thinking really more locally. And that's something that I think has gotten people even more engaged in what's going on, and kind of feeling like that's my that's my council district representative. They're mine in a way. And so I think that's also kind of changed a lot of the issues that are really localized.
Getting back to candidates running, this whole showing up at your house and canceling all that, that's sort of new. But there's always been an undercurrent for candidates of color and women, that they have just a baseline of abuse that is much higher than a white male. Has that changed? Has that gotten worse? Is it about the same? And how do you talk to candidates of color, especially women, about what may be said about them? And they're gonna judge them on their looks, on how they sound. I mean, all these metrics that don't apply to white men, and that's brutal. And plus, just the blatant sexism.
Mm-hmm. Yes, you saying this reminds me of the vote that happened. It's been a few years now, but around the Soto Arena.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
That's how they ended up on Samantha Bee's show with all of that, with the like we were the whole Sonics thing is.
Yeah, the Sonics thing. And I was working there at the time when I worked for Councilmember Burgess, who I believe supported it. And working for a white male, I was like, oh, there is no such scrutiny happening ever in this, in that way. And for the women and women of color on the council, it was horrible. It was misogynistic. It was rude. It had nothing to do with the policy itself. It became really personal. And that always sticks out to me, because I think for me as a woman of color, talking to fellow women of color running, I think I have to tell people, this is what you're going to potentially endure, and how do you stay healthy mentally? How do you take care of yourself? Is this something you really want to do? And I've worked with plenty of women of color candidates that you almost have to steel yourself. You have to put your armor on to go in. And I think that one of the hardest things is, for one, getting a bench of really good people, like a pipeline of candidates that want to run, and ensuring that we're supporting them once they're in. And what is that, how is the community showing up for our elected officials in those moments that we can't necessarily control, but how can we support the people that we've supported to get there once they're in office?
There becomes a mental health aspect to this whole thing. And I think because it's what you can withstand, and you're going to have some really thick skin, like armor level thick skin, it seems to me. No, it's true. I think I really do for women. It's been proven here in Seattle.
It is. And it's heartbreaking sometimes, because I think about people that, have put many years into public service, or into organizing or into their communities, and they're dedicated. And we really can be cruel to people that run for office, like through the campaigning process. People, are out there putting themselves on the line every day. And how do we really respect and kind of how do we show people respect and really even respect just the idea of public service?
Yeah. So again, that comes back to how do you get candidates and how do you set them up to run? I mean, do you go seek those people or they come to you basically to handle their campaigns? And is that, it seems to me that's got to be part of like a workshop you give them.
Yeah, so there's a few ways that people run for office. Sometimes I get messages online through our website, or people kind of know where to find us, so they'll reach out and say, I'm interested in running. I want to do this. Those are sort of the easy, sort of low-hanging fruit. People know that they want it. Then you have folks who are sort of exploring the idea of running. Maybe they've been around politics or they are interested. And there are some really great programs like Emerge Washington, Northwest Political, or sorry, the National Women's Political Caucus of Washington. They have these amazing training programs for women where they really just show them the nuts and bolts of campaigning. And so they're kind of learning before they even decide to run, that what it's all about, what it takes. And so that can be a really great way to learn kind of.
So how many people that enter those programs actually end up running? I mean, what's the ratio?
I don't know, but I think it's a pretty high ratio. I think a lot of,
okay, that's good.
like, we have some candidates right now that are in the Emerge training program. And so they're kind of learning and really getting up to speed. Whereas someone who's not going through a program, we're kind of teaching them as we go. And I think I also look at King County Councilmember Gurmai Zahalai has an amazing program called Build the Bench, where he teaches young folks how to run and just to really think about it as part of their future. So we get candidates in many ways. I also know people just from being in the political world for a while that I might lean over and say, I think you should consider running.
Yeah. Now,
it's funny. Enrique was actually recruited at one point.
Yeah. I've been
run in
recruited
the Ballard
times.
district.
Right.
I can see that.
And so why did you decide to run? I mean,
because I don't have the thick enough skin to deal with, well, two things actually. Well, maybe three. Well, one of them, it really interested me because, particularly when I retired, I thought, well, what's the next act I could do? Or do I really want to run? Or, do I want to work again full time? But I thought, okay, could I make a difference? I thought I could. The other part, but it hit me too, is that it really had to do with what it would take to run. The fact that you got to get on the phone and call people and ask for money, something that I would hate to do, but it's a reality. The other part of it really was that, I've had some struggles with my mental health and depression. And I thought, okay, is this going to then trigger something? Because I really do think the way things have changed now, you've got to have tremendously thick skin. You've got to be ready. Although, I'm a single guy, so I don't have to worry as much about my family. My kids are older and things. So I had that I wouldn't have to worry about as much. And although I would, sit down and talk to them about what it could mean. But really, I think that second factor was a big thing because I just thought, I don't want to, I've had a struggle with it before. I just really don't want to take that on and then not do a good job. If I'm going to do the thing, I got to do a good job. So that really, I think, was the big factor more than anything else. And so I decided, actually it was Tim Burgess that talked to me. And I went to him and said, Tim, here's the thing. I don't, this is an issue. And as much as I think I'd like to do this, I think it wouldn't be good for me. And I think you got to think about those things. You really got to think about those things. So Anyway, that was why. That was the bottom line to it. But I want to go back to during the time of the protests, the defund the Seattle movement and all of that, how it affected, because you guys represent those that are running for city council, many of them, as well as other offices locally. But how did that change or affect Seattle and the candidates that are running? Because I think there's still some it's a negative on Seattle right now. And anytime you bring up the council, that's a negative. And I think it goes back to that.
Yeah, I think it really became a litmus test for any candidates, especially that cycle that we're running. You know, are you going to do this? Are you going to defund the police or not? You know, and if you said yes, you were immediately you're on the stranger side. If you said no, or if you said, oh, wait, I have a nuanced approach to this, you were written off by a certain activist crowd. And I think that it was definitely a hot button issue that sort of became the hot potato that you just had to respond to. And I think, you know, many of the folks I worked with were like, actually, I don't want to do that. That's not what my community wants. This is more nuanced for Black and Brown communities who experience violence in their neighborhood and maybe need to call the police. And I think it's still an issue that candidates are being asked this time around, but a few years back, especially, it was the main topic, and it really kind of separated the candidates where they were, and I think in some ways people felt like this was the defining issue, even though it may not have been their top priority.
Right. It created that you're either with us or against us, and then even though we have moved on, I think, and now we're trying to get police because of our issues of crime. It still taints, I think, the city, and it really taints the council. And so I guess the other part of that I ask now is that there's going to be a change.
Yeah.
With the next. How's that looking?
It's a huge change. I mean,
yes,
we're basically flipping the entire council.
Yeah.
And I don't think people realize that, and each election cycle has sort of a kind of a meme. What do you think this one is? Well, I mean, what do you think the through line on this election is? Being reasonable, or because it's not going to be extremism and it's not going to be an ideological. What do you think the theme is?
I would hope that the theme is bold action on the issues we've been facing. I think reasonable to whom, that's the question. But I do believe that there's got to be some just decisive action taken, some plan.
So in other words, getting back to actual governance.
Yes.
Yeah. Instead of the ideology, getting caught up in ideology.
Yes, because I think ideology is just so divisive, and it can be really hard to explain yourself in 15 seconds, and that's all we're given. All we're given is just a quick bite to really say what we think as candidates, and I think that's harmful to the policymaking process, which is after we get elected, that's what people are there for, is to really solve hard problems.
So now that how would you handicap the city council race at this point? Because it's got to be really interesting from your guys' point of view of what's going to happen. But what do you think the electorate's at?
Well, we're emerging from the pandemic. Apparently that's over. I think that, in the past, I think
we'll see about that.
I know.
Yeah. Yes. Right. Yeah.
Anyway. What they're telling us.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
But I think that we're, in the past few years, we've really been sort of wanting this steady hand to guide us through. I think Mayor Harrell getting elected, that was sort of a nod to let's, have some stability. And I think that that's probably going to continue. I think we're kind of looking at how we're coming out of this pandemic economically, what is housing like, the rents, what is the situation with rents rising and people just still getting pushed out of the city. It's almost, I believe that we do still need some sort of balance and just sort of, I think that the electorate is really in the mood for nothing to rock the boat too much. As we've had,
but they want bold action, like you said, on the issues of crime, on the issues of bringing back downtown and homelessness.
yeah. And I think that means, bold action, I think really means creating a plan, having outcomes that are measurable and working toward it. And I think, with alternatives to policing, I think that's something really positive that came out of the defund movement. And I think oftentimes I come from an organizing background from way back, and I think that's always something that you organize for what you really want in the future, knowing that you're going to get maybe 40% of the way there. And I think when we think about policing and how we're actually looking at alternatives and standing up potentially another department or way to deal with sort of nonviolent offenses and really supporting people in ways in a way that doesn't bring a cop with a gun, I think that's progress. And so I think when I say bold action, I mean, really looking at what is going to solve these problems, and how can we move forward and not just get stuck kind of talking about them.
What do you think of the Inslee not running? I mean, talk about Game of Thrones, right? I mean, this guy's been in there forever. From my perspective, it's been fine. But it leaves a void. I mean, there's the heir apparent, right? There's the person that has a strong base. And then the Republicans, who knows what kind of lunatic they're going to run this time, right? I mean, that's the truth. Come on. So what do you think of that and how all that has kind of stacked up?
Yeah, I think we were kind of sitting and waiting last time around to see what was going to happen. The dominoes almost fell and then they didn't. And so this time, right. I think we were not too surprised. I think that Inslee's done an amazing job and, is ready to pass the baton. I think that, there's a whole new generation of people who are ready to take on higher office. And I do think there's an exciting field for governor and for attorney general. I think it's a good time. It's positive for the state.
Good. I mean, I make no bones about where I sit politically, right? But I just hope the chances of a Republican governor are pretty slim still. I mean, that's sort of where I'm at.
I think so. I think we've got some strong candidates coming out of the woodwork.
I want to go back to our city of Seattle. Do you see that our mayor, Bruce Harrell, has brought back, I guess, this moving back to the middle in the city? Instead of, because it seemed our council was really far off to the left, or at least had been during the time of, the protests and all of that, where things really just got ugly here.
But I think it's the middle for Seattle, right?
Well, that's what I mean. Yeah. Now, and the middle in Seattle is still to the left. Let's face it. But has it shifted? I guess in the sense of, because this next council that comes in, I mean, I'm sure he's looking at it, because for him to be able to do what he wants to do, he's got to have a council he can play with, which he hasn't. Which hasn't always been the case for mayors.
Yeah, and I think that's the trick when you've got districted council members,
right.
Is that you do get, a district where it's easier for a Shama Sawant to get elected, or Morales down in D2. Like we've had kind of more left-leaning folks get elected in districts. I think because there are those pockets. But across the board, I think for the last decade plus, we've had fairly moderate for Seattle mayors. We've had, I think, mayors that are very progressive and also are, you know, they're not they're not taking big progressive or like left-leaning strides. I think that Seattle has just tended to be sort of a left moderate city.
Had you ever considered running yourself?
I have, yes.
Okay, so explain to us.
Well, as I tell my candidates that I work with, it's all about the right seat at the right time. And there was a time a few years back where I had considered going for an appointment, and I didn't. And now we have an amazing legislator in that seat. And, you know, I will never close the door on it, but I think it is about timing, and really sometimes things happen at the right time, and we'll see. We'll see what happens.
You know, I've always found the District 3 dynamics really interesting, Sawant's district, because it's open now. I mean, whatever was going on there. I mean, do you think she read the tea leaves that said she was going to have a rough time of it, and it may not be worth it? But given that she's gone, what does it look like in District 3? Are we going to have another extremist in there, or do you think? I mean, what do you think?
Well, the way I see the field right now is that it's a lot of, I wouldn't say anyone's an extremist, at least from my point of view. So I do think that there are a lot of candidates that are kind of similar with values. There are a lot of people of color running, there are a lot of younger folks running. And I think there's a lot of attention on urbanism and looking at affordable housing and transit and, you know, renters issues. So I think we're going to see someone that really can, again, have some bold solutions for these problems. Like District 3 is kind of the place where all of these things are colliding. You know, we've got an unhoused population, we've got mental health crises happening, we've got high rents. Like, this is kind of where everything is coming to a head in some ways. And so I think there's definitely a need for someone that can address these issues in a meaningful way. Because for a long time, I think there's been a little more focus on ideology in that district, rather than really making change for constituents.
Mm-hmm. As someone who's observed governance on a lot of different fronts, what's it going to be like to have a relatively inexperienced city council? I mean, there's no, you know, with council member Perez leaving, a lot of institutional knowledge is going with her. So what do you think it's going to be like? Is it going to be, you know, initially sort of a clown car show, or is it going to be, are they think we're going to be able to elect people that have common sense and can really do the work?
I would encourage any new council member to hire some good staff.
Okay.
Like, your staff will carry you through. And I think that's really important. And there are a lot of folks that have, you know, worked at the council or know the inner workings. And I think it's a job that can be learned. But I do think there's a learning curve when it comes to being brand new. And especially having multiple new council members. I think that it will probably be, it'll be interesting to see what happens.
So before we go, the topic that we started with, and that was just this whole thing about civility. Do you think, what do we do to change that? Or can we at this point? Because I mean, I still look back to Trump opening the door for a lot of this stuff, but in fact, it really goes back to the 90s, I think, and to, you know, just the whole period of the contract with America and all this stuff. That was, to me, the start of it. And then Trump brought it to a whole different level. And now, you know, we see so much that just scares the heck out of us, happening on a daily basis. And at some point, I just think, you know, we're going to see something happen violently, something coming to someone's home as a public servant. So how do we get back to where we get some common sense and civility?
Ooh, I mean, I think it really does have to do with humanizing who our elected officials are, with maybe talking more openly and publicly about what it means to be a public elected official or to be engaged in public service. But I think when we don't humanize the folks that are representing us in office, that's where we really have the danger of having violence happen, or resorting to violence rather than talking it through. And so I think maybe even with districts, there might be opportunity, because we are going to be more in person now. I think being engaged with our local elected officials is an opportunity to do that, to really have town halls or have these kind of in-person conversations that we haven't been having for 3 years because we've been at our computers. But yeah, protests in the street did continue through the pandemic. And so I think we also saw that there was also kind of, we weren't really maybe engaging in other ways.
Right. I don't have any problem with people protesting in the streets as long as they do it peacefully and as civil as they can. I do think that going to someone's home is just totally out of line.
Yeah,
And,
especially if it's to intimidate them.
Yes, and that's a big issue that I just think, that's not right, and that's just, you go too far. So
yeah, and I think usually it's someone that says, "Let's go."
yeah, right.
Finding like who's that person that is saying, "Let's go to this house." And
Yeah.
who kind of took people the first time to Mayor Durkin's house.
And
Yeah,
who
well,
was behind all of that too. So yeah, as
well, we know. So
Yes, we know, we do. Hey,
So maybe that will change.
Seferiana, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. And hey, after the primary, would you come back and let's look at the field for what's happening in the city of Seattle?
Sure, I would love to.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
yeah, thank you.